Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's exciting session on Africa's NDC implementation within the context of a global food and energy crisis. As you know, we're here at COP27 because we're living through a climate crisis. And on top of that, the geopolitics have also unleashed two major crises that have serious implications for Africa's implementation of its nationally determined contributions. So this evening, I should first of all start by introducing myself. My name is Nachila Lankombo. I work for the WWF as a country director for Zambia. And I'll be moderating the panel this evening. To help us look at the implications of these two crises for Africa's successful NDC implementation, we have with us an eminent panel that's going to help us unpack the issues and point us to what Africa needs to do to make sure that progress is not held back. We're here at COP because this is an accountability mechanism, and they say that what is not measured actually does not count. So we need to make sure that we can account for the impacts of the global energy and food security crisis on Africa's ability to deliver its NDCs. So the first speaker that we have joining us today to discuss this topic is Jackie Kimel, a colleague of mine, who is the Energy and Climate Change Coordinator working with WWF Kenya. Jacqueline is the Energy and Climate Coordinator at WWF Kenya with 12 years of experience in developing and implementing effective programs around energy and climate in sub-Saharan Africa. Welcome, Jackie. And the second speaker is Vanessa Vysen. Vanessa Vysen is a senior planner working for GIZ and is with us today to bring GIZ perspective on how the two crises are going to affect Africa's delivery of its NDCs. We're also privileged to have Miriam Medel, the Chief of Global Policy and Advocacy at the UNCCD Secretariat. She coordinates the support to parties in the fight against desertification and drought. As you know, we have several Rio conventions, and so the UNCCD is one of them. The UNFCCC is the other. So it's always important for us to be able to make the various connections. The next speaker is none other than our very own food practice leader, Joao Campari from WWF International. Joe, you want to raise your hand so that people know who we have? And lastly, but not the least, on our team is Madam Fernando Calvajo. She's the head of policy, of climate and energy policy at WWF International. And again, because we're looking at both energy and food security, for us it's important that we can draw in the expertise that exists in the various practices of WWF. We might be joined by a fourth speaker from the African Development Bank. Could that be you? Yeah, her name is Davina, but I think to just sort of get us started, we're here and thanks to our partners, the GIZ, and also the Rio Convention partners, GCF and GEF, to discuss this very important topic. As you know, Africa is a net food importer, so it means our food system is unsustainable. We also know that globally the agriculture system has to reform because it's contributing significantly to the emissions that we have. So we cannot have a business as usual approach in terms of managing our energy and agriculture systems, but at the same time, we know we are dealing with a compounded problem having a global energy and food security crisis. So the objective of this session, I should say, is to discuss with the panel and all of you, in this context of these two crises, Africa's implementation of its NDCs to make sure that its ambition and impact is not undermined. We would like to showcase the need for cross-cutting collaborative approaches between energy transition and also agriculture transitions that lend themselves as imperatives for African countries for them to be successful. We also want to explore the required support, such as tools and guidance, to the parties in Africa in terms of how they ensure that progress is not decelerated but is actually accelerated going forward. So perhaps to kick us off, we are going to start with the first question with Jackie. Jackie from Kenya, from WWF Kenya. So Jackie, can you please share with us what you see in Kenya as the current drivers and trends in the energy transition in Africa, in the light of this growing geopolitical context where we have a large looming global energy crisis as well as a large looming global food security crisis?
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. Happy to be here today. As introduced, I work in WWF Kenya as Energy and Climate Change Coordinator, and I want to first paint a picture on the effects of the geopolitical, sector in Africa and in Kenya specifically. First and foremost, we all know that in Africa we have close to 700 million people without access to electricity. And at the same time, we have close to 600 million people without access to clean cooking. Our governments in Africa are doing well in terms of ensuring that we sort of leapfrog to renewable energy. And by this, I mean that our NDCs, 45 countries out of 53 countries have already developed NDCs, which have clear targets on renewable energy, for example. But the challenge now that we have is the Ukraine-Russia war has really impacted on our progress to achieve the set targets in the NDCs. So with the current situation, we are lagging behind. We are backtracking in terms of achieving the set targets on renewable energy in Africa. And I say this because for the last few months, where we have been having this challenge, we see that energy prices have gone really high in African countries. And by this, we see, for example, we had long queues in terms of getting, transport fuel and other stuff. So this has really impacted on our plans as a country to transition to renewable energy. And by having high fuel prices, most African countries have been able now to go back to other non-renewable energy resources that they were not using before because of an unreliability of the fuel. Looking at countries like Bangladesh, where there's always been a very high unreliability because of lack of electricity, because of the global crises that are happening. So when there is an unreliability of electricity, then people turn to other resources. They are also not able to do productive work. For example, because energy is an enabler of other development issues. So we see that we are sort of going back. We are not going to meet our NDC target because of insufficient energy, because of this global situation. Again, we see that shipping of renewable energy resources that are set in the NDC target has also become a challenge because of the geopolitical situation that we are experiencing. And by this, countries that had committed to use solar, wind have really sort of resorted to other and alternative ways because they cannot be able to import renewable energy products that are needed for them to transition to renewable energy. And then also, when you look at West Africa, we are seeing that because of this uncertainty in the energy sector, some countries have revived what their natural gas, systems, and we are talking about this because such countries had already abandoned some of these fossil fuel issues, but now they are going back because they want certainty in terms of their energy, security as a country. So there is a clear picture that with the current geopolitics, we are not able to achieve the energy targets set in the NDCs. I also talk about issues to do with the finance commitments that are supposed to be happening. Again, a lot of focus has gone to how do we deal with the energy challenge that we have without focusing much on what we need to do. And countries are setting short-term targets for them to fix the energy situation that they have without looking at the long-term situation for just energy transition in Africa.
Okay, so we may be trapped in this vicious circle because
Yeah.
of the geopolitical context. And I think from the experience of Kenya and other countries you have cited, indeed, this geopolitical energy crisis runs a risk of setting back Africa, and maybe not just Kenya. But maybe I can move to Miriam to just to pick it up from there. In view of what we've heard, that the conflict, the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, has disrupted what was promising as an avenue for African countries to develop further its improved access to renewable energy. That has since been disrupted. What do you see as the opportunities for African countries to go around that problem? Because falling back to unsustainable forms of energy is not going to help us in the fight against climate change. So from your perspective, what opportunities do you still see within this challenging context?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that is actually a very relevant and very timely question because Africa, I mean, in our organization, we work a lot with the Sahel, and we are the organization that is nurturing the Great Green Wall Accelerator. So the Great Green Wall Initiative Accelerator, which if people do not know what it is this initiative to restore I don't know exactly the exact number of hectares, but it goes for across 11 countries in Africa, in the Sahel, which is the border of the Saharan desert. The Sahel can be, because of all the conditions and all the problems that has had, but also because the opportunity it represents. We believe at the UNCCD that the Sahel can be a laboratory of hope and a laboratory of action for the world. Why? Because they could go immediately. They do not need to transition from non-renewable energy sources to renewable. They can immediately start implementing renewable and adjusting to renewable energy sources. We also see...
Do they have capacity? I think one of the issues Jackie raised was that they're not able to import components that are needed to facilitate a use of renewable energy options like in Kenya.
It is true, and we see actually real tragedies, for example, with cooling and refrigeration. So they are very much reliant on agriculture, and the very terrible thing that happens is that the agricultural products, perish or go to waste immediately because there was no way to keep them refrigerated to bring them to their final destination. So what NDCs can do is really, they can serve as the instrument for access to better finance, transfer of technology, and actually they could become the accountability instrument for donors to actually translate their pledges into real action that arrives to the communities and to the companies, to the local communities, local businesses that are the ultimate implementers of the nationally determined contributions. Final point, on the importance of land restoration for NDCs. Because that is, I mean, I do need to make a commercial for the UNCCD. Land restoration it offers multiple co-benefits, and we are not seeing enough pledges in the NDCs from Africa associated to land restoration, which can be very cost effective, and it is not as expensive as other interventions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Imelda, for those, Miriam, for those insights. So you've mentioned to us that the Sahel could be the laboratory of solutions, where we could actually look positively about the global crisis, where they say necessity is the mother of invention, and African countries can actually leapfrog if the actions are clearly spelled out within the NDCs. So if we shift to Vanessa, I think we've been challenged, or donors have been challenged, that actually the current global context creates new opportunities for delivery of pledges. So when you look at, we've touched on the energy system or the energy sector. When you look at the current drivers and trends in the food systems shifting in Africa, what do you see as the opportunities that present themselves with NDC implementations to actually take a food systems approach? We know that part of the challenge with the UNFCCC is the fact that in Coronovia, a focus is only looking at the emissions from the food system, from the farm, and not the entire value chain, an entire system. And I think that if that has to be rectified, the revision of our NDC implementation plans in Africa could create an opportunity where all emissions across are actually accounted for. So from the perspective of GIZ, in terms of what you've seen on the ground, so what would you say are the opportunities and challenges that needs to be taken into account from a food systems perspective as we're looking at protecting NDC implementation in Africa?
Thanks very much. Yes, I'll maybe split the question in two. First of all, what are the current drivers and trends in the food system in light of the current geopolitical crisis, and how did the NDCs fit into this context? How can they be used as an opportunity? To grow food, you all know we need fertilizer. It's maybe not the most sexy topic and the most interesting, but it is actually really, really important. So, obviously, Russia is one of the largest actually exporters of fertilizer when it comes to nitrogen or other phosphorus, etc. And a total of 25 countries worldwide obtain more than 30% of their fertilizer imports from Russia. As you know, due to the Russian sanctions, Africa is really, really dependent on fertilizer also. Now I'm talking about mineral fertilizer, synthetic. So I give you just a few numbers. Cameroon is importing 50%, so half of all the fertilizer comes from Russia, which is gone basically. Ghana 38, Senegal 35, Mauritania nearly 30, Cote d'Ivoire and Morocco 28% each. And Benin, the only country, depend on imports from both Russia and Ukraine with about 15%. So we have a large dependence here. And looking at the geopolitical context and the sanctions on Russia, the current situation is actually fertilizer prices have been really high even before the war on the Ukraine. But now they've really reached the highest levels ever. And so they're not payable anymore to smallholders and African farmers, which is really like, it's a crisis. It's like a huge, huge crisis, because what has been also predicted is 30 to 40% of fertilizer is missing in the African continent. So all this food won't be produced. It won't be there, basically. So, and we just talked about energy and the connections to food. It takes quite a lot of energy actually to produce fertilizer as well. So this is quite an energy-intensive process, and as they're also, we also end this energy crisis, which are also costs which are adding up again to the fertilizer. So what is the impact of all this? So if, as I said, prices for fertilizer are really, really have reached the highest level, they're just not payable anymore to African farmers. So many countries also subsidize fertilizer. So this again is really difficult for their national household budget. This will also go into fertilizer. At the same time, we know fertilizer, and now I talk about synthetic mineral fertilizer, is a huge driver for climate change emissions. 11% of all emissions come from fertilizer, mineral synthetic fertilizer. So we really, but I think again, to achieve the climate commitments, and now we're here sitting at COP, and we really want to make a difference, it really needs the agri-food system to change. We want to have a change towards, in also including the fertilizer sector. And I think the NDCs can be an opportunity because fertilizer and soil health, they hold really key elements, to cut emissions while strengthening at the same time the resilience of food security. So what basically GIZ does, and most projects we implement are funded by the German Development Ministry, they, across numerous programs in Africa, we try to get away also from the mineral synthetic fertilizer to, actually substitute it with ecological organic fertilizer programs to disseminate good agricultural practices for a better soil fertility, site-specific fertilizer recommendations, knowledge sharing, all these things that people in Africa can actually become independent, as we talk for the energy sector, to go into renewables, which is now the best time ever. The same thing applies to the agricultural sector, to have basically to switch to ecologically fertilizer and management practices for soil fertility. Again, obviously, there's lots more I could say about this. But
In fact, I just want to follow up on that. I think the German government does support, you're right, a lot of projects that support regenerative agriculture, agroecological approaches, and with the disruption in the fertilizer global supply chain, don't you think it's an opportunity for these agroecological approaches to be brought up to scale, and maybe for more organic alternatives, fertilizer, maybe industry local to emerge. And I think a lot of times locally led food systems adaptation solutions have been proven to be successful, but the scaling has been limited by this dominant fertilizer industry. So the fact that there has been a disruption, I think, could create an opportunity. And then I also want to pick it up from the point that was raised by Miriam, in the sense that we perhaps may need to look at the set of interventions working together, including land restoration, including adopting at scale more nature-positive agriculture approaches that could be supported in terms of enabling farmers, but also looking at, what other renewable energy solutions could still be developed. In most rural African countries, I think there has been efforts to promote the generation of energy or even gas from waste, from agriculture waste, as an example. Is there opportunities for donors to come in, maybe from the UNCCD perspective, from the GIZ perspective, again, to bring some of these solutions to scale, because they can make a huge difference in terms of promoting circularity of local economies, of local agriculture, and indeed reducing the dependency on chemical fertilizer that you had raised. So maybe both, maybe Miriam and Vanessa, would you like to respond to that? Either one of you?
Yeah, maybe I could just, well, of course, as I said, I think it's a really good opportunity now to really, go into implementation and, scale up all these, really good programs which are happening already with ecological, organic practices. You mentioned land use, which is really, really important as well. And also we haven't really talked about also about water. I think the whole nexus between water, energy and food is really important, because 70% of all freshwater resources we need for agriculture. So we also need to carefully manage it. And there are initiatives already there, to actually work exactly in this nexus.
Excellent. You want to add to that?
Just very quickly, I mean, I think, yes, absolutely right. Nature-based solutions are 30% of the solutions that are necessary for to keeping the temperature up to 1.5 degree. The African NDCs have recognized this. However, the one thing that is not entirely spelled out is how to make them more concrete, how to make them more fundable, and then by defining measurable and spatial explicit targets for all the relevant ecosystems. And here again, UNCCD comes in, because in the UNCCD parties have the pledge, there is land degradation neutrality targets. It's a voluntary pledge. That's the difference. So probably one step ahead, actually, that would help parties and countries internally is to compare and to harmonize the land degradation neutrality target with the NDC to advance and to make them more, as I said, more concrete and more fundable.
Excellent. So I think I'll turn to the audience now in case you have any questions for the panel. It is clear that the two global crises actually put the implementation of African NDCs at risk. However, we should not just fold our hands. We should look for ways and provide guidance to the parties in terms of what they could do, even within this challenging context. So are there any questions from the audience to the panelists on this topic? Even comments are welcome.
All right. Thank you for the opportunity. First and foremost, I would like to say that the NDCs for Africa are not implementable in the first place because they do not have the capacity, the environment, the fund to do all of that. And I love the way you put it, that there is a need for an accountability instrument to the implementers of this. I move around Africa, and when we talk, and I've been in most panels and most panel sessions, and I listen a lot of talks, and they do not reflect what is happening there. It's as if when you come here, oh, all these things, where are they happening? But you go there, nothing is happening. And then you look at the energy crisis we are talking about. For a country where I come from, that is required to reach the target of net zero, they had a pathway to 2020 through 2030, and they had to do that through implementation of gas utilization. 2030, this is 2023, 2022 to 2033. In less than, they've not even scratched the opportunities, they've not even started. They will not be able to meet up with that, and I'm not sure they're going to meet up with, simply because the fund is not there. On the food aspect, policies, infrastructures, when you produce, these farmers are producing. I was opportune to travel to some places. They produce, there's no market, there's no access to road access to those places, and there is no processing industries and all of that. So these are the areas we need to be talking about. The government needs to, beyond all the talks, NDC, this, that, there are infrastructural problem and fund problem in Africa. And then until that is done, we will not be able to achieve some of these things. The energy poverty in Africa is huge, and that also ripples to even the food availability. If you don't have power, you cannot store, you cannot preserve your food products, and then you cannot even transport and all of that. So we have a fundamental problem of policy, infrastructure, fund, enabling environment. The continent has been characterized with huge insecurity problem, ranging from terrorism, inter-tribal clashes. All these things are affecting. Nothing is happening. So people come and say, oh, we are doing this in Africa, we are doing this in Africa. They just end up in the state capitals of the countries, and the people in the remote, in the rural areas are suffering They have no idea of all of this. And we have agencies, associations, whatever you call them, advocacy groups, and this is not happening. I see those advocacy groups and whatever as a means of people enriching themselves, whether we like it or not, is the truth. It's not happening. Maybe Africans, we should look inward and look at indigenous solutions beyond the NDC just because we want to play at the same level with the rest of the world and speak grammar and all of that. Maybe we have to look inward in our indigenous solutions to solve this. And we should not forget that Africa as well contribute 3.8%. And the huge of this burden should not be on us. So we have to review all of this. So when you are saying, oh, this is where you should be, this is what you should do, we should consider this. Nobody is considering the energy poverty. Nobody is considering the scarcity of water, the desert encroachment. We don't see things like that. And you're placing limitation. And just the other day, was it Uganda and Tanzania? They had a pipeline, and the lawyer from the EU, with due respect, sued them that they should not, implement that fossil this thing. Meanwhile, we've seen in the rest of the world where they are going back to even coal. And some of them are moving to Africa, setting up industries in Africa, and then that also add up to the carbon footprint in Africa. And because taking advantage of the awareness and the understanding, knowledge about the carbon market and all of that. So these are the things we need to address, and not to speak grammar and all of that. And I'm glad that this COP is implementation. And let's really do that implementation. We have commitments that, oh, these developing nations, this is what we're going to do. And who is talking about that from COP26? Nobody is talking about that in this COP. And by next COP, we will come back, the same grammar all over. Let's talk about this talk. We want to see people come in, do what you have to do. Accountability instrument that we can say this is what is being done. So what I see is nothing is happening, and let's not bother, extrapolating this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those remarks. I think they just remind us that context is king. The context or the starting points for NDC implementation. My point of view is that I think we still have an opportunity as we are revising the NDC for us as Africans to put the realities in these NDC action plans and the priorities, which includes the type of infrastructure and the type of enabling environment that will support our transition our own way. I think I'll take this opportunity now to invite João maybe to make some comments on what we have heard. João, you know that in Coronovia and also in most African NDCs, there's certain critical food system challenges that are not captured there. For food loss, food waste, the role of energy or unsustainable energy in terms of really driving emissions from the sector. So what would your advice be to the African parties in terms of dealing with those issues, but also responding to the global energy and food security crisis?
Thank you, Nachilala. Delighted to be here. Can you hear me on the mic? No? Yeah? Okay, I guess this is good now. I'm not going to offer advice because sometimes advices are to be given but not necessarily followed. So I'd like to share some perspectives. When we talk about, I could not agree more with what you said, by the way. When we talk about food and climate, or energy and climate, we can phase out fossil fuel to resolve the energy part of the equation of climate. But we cannot phase out food, right? So we need to work within the food system to help resolve the climate crisis. Now, the food system, and this means production, transport, distribution, loss and waste, accounts for 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. So if we resolve all the other sectors of the economy but do not resolve the food system, we are not going to be following the 1.5 degree pathway, okay? So, and when we talk about the food system, everybody, and this is most invariably, think about agricultural production. Agriculture is super important, but there are emissions that come from other parts of the food system. If we think of the food system as production, consumption, and food loss and waste, and if we measure the mitigation potential for each one of these, this is what you will find. If you change production alone, the mitigation potential is between 14 and 40% of those 30% that the food sector emits. If you talk about food loss and waste, if we reduce food loss and waste, we can mitigate between 8 and 10%. If you change consumption patterns, and this is shifting dietary patterns, the contribution, the mitigation potential is up to 48%. So if we only look at agriculture, we are missing all the options that we have, right? And I'm not talking about eating meat or not eating meat, please. Okay, there are many countries that we've measured at WWF. We have the planet-based diet, in which we say that in some contexts, people live in such a fragile way that they need to increase the amount of animal source foods that they consume. Whereas in other countries, this is really it's consumed beyond. It's excessive, so this needs to reduce. So the message is that I said I could not agree more. Commitments move faster than action, especially in these global events, right? We need to put action where our mouth is. So, and one of the ways to do this is to, really advocate for countries to change their NDCs and put a full food system approach into their NDCs. Because so far, I'm going to read some numbers now. It's very encouraging that in the past year, the number of NDCs that mention food has increased, but not by very much, from 107 to 125 countries, right? But the ones that mention diet, for example, it's only 5 of them mention diet transitions as part of their NDCs. And only 36 countries mention actions on food loss and food waste in their NDCs. So we need to increase this. We need to advocate for countries to embrace a whole of food system approach, okay? And not think about silos. Another aspect that I'd like to highlight, countries are not placing enough emphasis on the solutions that their own communities bring to climate change. And less than half of all updated NDCs mention indigenous peoples and local communities, right? And still fewer mention the importance of smallholder farmers. So the solutions that we often hear that are available in the countries somehow do not break the system. They do not resolve the lock-ins in the system that prevents these solutions from scaling up, from being leveraged. So let me stop here, Nachilada. These are a few reflections connecting food and the NDCs that I have to share. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Zhao. And maybe I can ask the next speakers to bring the mic close to their mouth so that the audience can hear. Zhao, I just want to agree with you on both points. The fact that African NDCs are really missing out on accelerating progress by not looking at a whole of food system approach. Because within that, there's lots of opportunities in terms of really, with small effort, that our emissions can be reduced. That's one. Secondly, we know that a number of nature-based solutions, either to the food challenge or to the energy challenge, have been developed in Africa locally. However, there's always been a gap between policy and public sector programs recognizing these solutions. I'll give you an example. 2 months ago, I was moderating a session in Zambia where we were discussing with the Minister of Finance and other stakeholders the proposed national budget for next year for Zambia. And I was asking the minister how what has been provided for in terms of climate adaptation and mitigation. And he says to me, well, in my constituency, this is the Minister of Finance, in my constituency, these are the adaptation actions we are taking at the local level. I was very happy to hear that because it means he's providing leadership. But what I was expecting more to hear is how he's using that experience to influence public financing on agriculture. Because what's going on in his constituency is also happening in several constituencies. So I think there's a whole paradigm shift that we need to look at in terms of looking at where opportunities exist within our public policies, within our public finances, to really make sure that without it being too painful, we can actually adapt and put ourselves on the path of contributing to the 1.5 target. But now I think I'm going to shift to Fernanda to just give her perspectives in terms of what has been presented as a big challenge. Millions of Africans are off the grid. There's energy poverty. Every politician is under pressure to resolve that. And most of our communities depend on unsustainable energy. So just because there's energy poverty does not perhaps justify the continuation of business as usual. So what opportunities do you see that the NDC implementation can grab from this COP to really support a successful energy transition in Africa?
Okay, so can you hear me? Okay, so it's my pleasure to be here today talking to you. I think I'm coughing here, but it's no COVID. It's because of the air conditioning. But we heard some great words from our colleagues. I think that we heard about the challenges in Kenya, and we are in times of crisis. It's a fossil fuel dependency crisis because we at WWF are stressing this. It's not an energy crisis because energy is available. It's just unequally produced and distributed. So I think that's important. And I also heard in an event that we had in our pavilion that sustainable energy is freedom energy because it frees us from our dependency in unsustainable sources. I'm getting used to those noises. We just have to stop and start again. But I think that we had also great points from Miriam, and I'd like to thank you for your presence in the last minute. This is great that you could join our panel because you mentioned that, NDCs can be a reference for finance, technical cooperation, transfer of technology, capacity strengthening. I'm not using capacity building anymore because I think there are capacities in countries. We just need to cooperate to strengthen them. And also for accountability of donor commitments. This is very in line with an initiative by WWF, which is the NDCs we want. We started analyzing NDCs against 5 criteria because we think NDCs are much more than a target. They are actually social pacts that need to be bought in by the whole of society because at the end of the day, those are the ones that are going to be implementing NDCs. So the criteria we look at are ambition from a perspective on mitigation, adaptation, and finance. We look at fostering systemic changes. So we look at a sectoral approach, social policies, and just transition. This is key for the African region. We look at inclusiveness and participation. We believe that NDCs are as good as society participates in their development and also in their implementation. And also tracking process. In 2020, we did an analysis for the Africa Regional Week, and we had a look at NDCs because we classified them from the NDCs we don't want to NDCs we want, which are top NDCs according to all those criteria. And in Africa, we had at that time Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Cabo Verde as NDCs we want. Kenya with a short way to go, which is like a second place NDC. And this is very, very nice. So we started thinking about how to continue working and what we can do, what would be an NDCs we want phase 2. And now we're thinking about, policy implementation toolkits to try to support countries building on our network potential. We have more than 100 offices, lots of offices in Africa, and we want to look at sectors. We are looking now at the food sector in a partnership with the GIZ, and we also want at the energy sector. What do we want to do? We want to work on strengthening and building governance and the policy frameworks for countries to be implementing their NDCs. We know this is very hard, specifically in times of crisis, and of course we can't be so naive to think that that doesn't depend on funding. Of course we have to mobilize funding so countries can achieve their objectives. So this is the work that WWF is already doing and is interested in broadening and strengthening. And we think that now at this COP there is something going on, which are discussions on a mitigation work program that you also have heard about. So when we think about mitigation, many think that mitigation is an agenda of rich countries, that they have to reduce energy and etc. And it's not. It's also very much an agenda for poor and vulnerable countries. Why? Because the most we can minimize impact, the least we'll have to do on loss and damage and also on adaptation. So mitigation is also an agenda to reduce impacts, and we need to build what mitigation means for Africa. And I think that cuts across a lot of things that were said here. Poverty eradication, it's very, very important. Addressing food systems, which is a key problem in Africa, and of course tackling energy with more sustainable energy and also with just transition. So I think we can build that vision within the mitigation work program. That's how we can connect, you know, the negotiations that are going in this room. The Coronivia process is really, really key also to provide the guidance for addressing the whole of the food systems. I think that work of organizations like WWF, like GIZ can help bring this implementation vision to the ground. And although we are in a time of crisis, and in times of crisis, as you mentioned, Jackie, this is very, very hard not to backslide. I think that it's a time for Africa not to take short-term decisions that can, you know, have long-term impacts and lock us in pathways that are not sustainable and delay the energy transition. So I think that, you know, developed countries have to do part on this, and I think we can all together try to address those very complicated issues. I'm not going to say this is easy, I can't say, but I want to say that here you have many partners, and one of them is WWF trying to join this fight with you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Fernanda, for really bringing home the perspectives that a just transition is non-negotiable for Africa. And for me, it's important that as Africa, we keep reminding ourselves that it's in our NDC action plans, in their clarity, in the specificity of the targets and the financial requirements, that we're going to deliver mutually accountable actions on the ground, ourselves with our developing partners. If we decide to have NDC implementation plans that are vague, that are not addressing all sources of emissions, then we are shooting ourselves in the foot. We're lucky that Davina is here from the African Development Bank, so she can also add her perspectives in terms of how Africa can ensure that it doesn't fall back, right, in terms of really clarifying what needs to be done after this COP to deliver successful NDCs. And African Development Bank have a big lever there to make sure that we are successful. Over to you.
Right, thank you so much, and apologies I came in late. I had urgent thing to deal with. But well, I'm here, and thank you so much for inviting the Africa Development Bank to join this conversation. Indeed, NDCs are very fundamental documents or commitment documents that shape the way that countries look at the trajectory. It's very important that there's a built-in revision which will be important as these conversations feed into the next iterations of those documents. So just very quickly how we see this. One, there's deep leadership on the African countries about this process, at least the Paris Agreement. We have, I think to date, 40-something countries that have improved their NDCs. That is work. I mean, it's taking away from the many, many things they're doing. So the fact that they actually remember to update their NDCs, that is commitment. That they need to be made halfway with that. Two, we have, at the African Union leadership, we have a committee of heads of state on climate change. I'm not sure there's any region that has that level of heads of state coming up to set an agenda on climate change. So these things at a political level, there is leverage. Now, we are here again on implementation. Then things become difficult. One, because even with the strategies that we had for agriculture, for energy, the 10-year or 30-year development programs that the countries already have, those are good enough that we could actually align NDCs with development plans in a way that you don't have to feed into one document, feed into another document, feed into an app, feed into different processes. In the next versions or whatever, I think it will be important to have harmonized systems that articulate the needs and articulate the MRVs and transparency requirements. Last point on finance, that is critical. That is the elephant in the room. That's why all of us are here at COP. That's what we've been told. There are pockets of resources that can be leveraged. I've had things like blended finance. MDBs like ourselves need to take more risks so that private sector can be crowded in. How do we take risks? We need our shareholders to be less conservative, because an MDB looks at its ranking. It's the rating agency, you have to have your AAA. If our shareholders mean business, they would send the message that be less risk averse. That would crowd in resources that would then trickle down. Because the kind of projects that we have on food security, on energy security, are really at the base of the pyramid. It's peasant farmers that need funding. Those are rarely, because they're high risk, those rarely get to the portfolio of MDBs like ourselves. And that's where the masses are. That's where the people that engage with nature are. And so we have to find financing that speaks like that. I'm glad to start hearing that we're looking for grant-funded adaptation. That's very critical. That moves the needle, because we are not going to expect that, yes, even the little 4% climate finance there is, when you look at our portfolio, what we report as climate finance, 80% is loans. That is not going to cut it, because these countries are already indebted. And so looking for finance that is not largely loans, that reaches the communities in a way that it can transform, so we build from the bottom up, that is very critical. And we have, I'll mention two transformative programs that we have, and we hope that they'll get very supported. One is on the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, which is a 25 billion program, but it's a very holistic approach. So it looks at energy, it looks at agriculture, it looks at youth, it looks at innovative finance. The second one is called the Desert to Power, which aims to create a solar belt around the Sahel, all the 11 countries around the Sahel belt, and create that radiation resource into solar programs. It aims to generate 10 gigawatts of power. What that means, it then transforms the food systems, because then it's renewable energy. It creates new jobs, and of course, it deals a lot with nature because of less deforestation around that belt. So those are the two big programs. In terms of finance, we are trying to, with our concessional window called the Africa Development Fund, in its next replenishment, We are trying to have a dedicated climate action window. If we get that, it is a 13 billion at the most ambitious level over 3 years. If we get that replenishment, it will change the way we do business, because then we have a dedicated fund. To date, when you come to do your NDC support, it goes through a trust fund. Trust funds have GCF-GEF. It's a long process. So if we get dedicated funds that you can tap into, revise your NDCs, to do your tools, it makes things a whole lot faster.
Okay.
Sorry, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your additions. I think it's good to hear, first of all, the affirmation that there's African leadership. African governments recognize themselves that more needs to be done to revise and clarify the NDC ambitions. And I think for us as WWF, it really excites us because it means that it creates an opportunity for partnership. However, I should also say that funding, as you mentioned, is very critical. And if the bank is using its position to demonstrate how effective climate finance looks like on the African continent, in different African countries, I think it would really be helpful in terms of really showing other donors, other partner countries the way in terms of what needs to be delivered. I think that climate risk or the climate crisis has already caused enough death, right? Climate crisis has damaged enough property. And climate is threatening loads of futures, all of our futures. And I think my appeal to perhaps the finance community is that let's accelerate the pace at which this climate finance can be unlocked. I was at another session where a mention was made around the fact that there's finance in Africa, right? And a lot of that finance is dormant finance. So how can we have an active and targeted conversation? So if we're talking about Desert to Power as an initiative, right? So which perhaps unsustainable sources of energy today the Sahel countries are depending from, and what is the time frame we're actually giving ourselves? Because we should not get to COP28 discussing plans. We should get to COP28 having clarity to say that this is how many African NDC action plans have, including the whole food system in there. How many African NDC action plans have maintained their course in terms of really shifting towards freedom energy, as we've been told, the more renewable energy. And I think that it really takes everyone, a whole of society approach to bring government providing the leadership at implementation level, getting the multilateral development banks, getting private sector also playing their role in sharing the risk and making the investments that's actually needed. I'm just gonna ask for another round of questions or contributions before we wrap up the session. Is there anyone else with some reflections?
Thank you very much. My name is Kwame from Ghana. I work for the Agricultural Development Bank, and I'm very interested in what AFDB just spoke about. We deal with farmers, smallholder farmers, and these farmers are truly small. However, when it comes to helping these farmers with these adaptation programs, the NDBs and the funding they have, which they say is small, is way bigger than the small farmer in Africa or in our parts of the world can easily access. So we approach you, or we approach all of such NDBs to access these funds, and the criteria is way beyond what we can access for them. What is different now? Are we truly ready to avail these, to us to make them available to these small, very thresholds that these ones can afford to take up and use? That's what my question is for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very, very clear question. How do we make the funding more easily accessible to where it's needed the most? I don't know, Davina, if you want to respond to that or anybody else, because this is a challenge not only for African Development Bank. Unfortunately, out of this COP, there has to be transformations in most of the banks and donor agencies also for relevance and impact of your financing on climate to be recorded going forward. When we started off, we talked about the fact that if we cannot measure a thing, then it does not count. So he's got farmers, they're impacted by climate change, they need to adapt. For them, it's not even a question. How can the new finance instruments really be responded to them?
Yeah, very pertinent question there. And I think that's the crux of the matter. Ultimately, like I began saying, we are in an institution of shareholders. If the shareholders still want finance flowing in the traditional risk averse nature, we're going to be here for many, many COPs. So what needs to happen is a realization that the rating of our AAA, yes, we might have the AAA rating, but where does that lead to the farmers you're speaking to? Yes, we'll have good rating, we'll borrow money, but that's at the end of it all, we borrow it for those people, but it's not getting to them. So what needs to happen is a transformation of the financing system. How is that done? One is to look into where it has worked, because oftentimes we don't get to hear the success stories. And I'm sure on your loan book or your portfolio, there are very good stories that we need to hear more of. I was in the youth pavilion over there. There were youth that are doing agribusiness very proudly so, brought themselves to COP with their small businesses. If we could take those, and they were speaking here to how they do it, how they de-risk their businesses, those are the models we take. But I guess we're very comfortable to make this step, to get crowding those. And I'm sure as they get more aggressive and more bullish, they're going to force us to change our business models, because ultimately, where is the money flowing? So, so let's give the space to those businesses, to those agribusinesses that have worked. For sure, at the bank, we've tried to do credit lines. What happens is the reporting requirement. It's not that the money isn't there, but how do you tell a small farmer that, define adaptation and give me targets and results based and they don't. At the last Climate Week, Africa Climate Week, one of the representative of indigenous people came up and said, please, tell me how to define net zero to my community. Because language is also important. The requirements that we put to these communities matter. Yeah, and so we need to shift around that. And that shift might not come from us because of where we sit. It will have to come from that revolution that is the youth that are doing things that actually move, because ultimately when I go to the shop and I find the vegetables that is what I buy. And I wish we'd do more of that so that there is a shift from the bottom up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope that was satisfactory, but it is a start. I just want to say that time is of essence for for all of us. And I think we have the privilege of being at COP. A lot of the people that are dealing with the climate impacts do not have that privilege to be here. And I think it's our responsibility to come out of here with concrete plans that are really going to protect lives, that are going to protect livelihoods going forward. I think we've had the issues. What's encouraging for me is to just get the feedback just on the number of African countries that have revised their NDC targets. If it's one thing that's in short supply in most of the government ministries is capacity. And if they are spending some time to relook at those plans, I think that's a positive trajectory. Right now, as we sit in Egypt, as the planet is off track in terms of meeting 1.5, and so we cannot remove our eyes off the ball globally, right, in terms of bringing down the emissions. Even though Africa is impacted the most by the downside, we've paid upfront for the cost of climate change. I think this is critically important that out of this COP, we have the clearest targets on mitigation. We have the clearest targets on adaptation. And we pull in all the institutions that we have within their countries to help with the implementation. And I think when it comes to the finance question, I think it's important and it's safe to say that currently the finance system is failing in the fight against climate change. And if it's failing in supporting this just and sustainable food systems transition that is critical for our survival, if it's failing in supporting the renewable energy transition, what support can we give that community? Because we need to move together. It is not either or. It's not about maintaining business as usual. It's about really challenging ourselves to think outside the box. And I think it will not just take one sector, it will take several sectors to resolve the issues. A number of times climate has been engaged or discussed as a sector on its own, but I think that's part of the mistake that we have made. And I was very happy to hear from Fernanda that, look, the work has to go to the sectors. It has to go to the social sectors, it has to go to the economic sectors, so that each of the sectors take account in terms of what needs to be done to reduce emissions. So for example, if you look at the food system or even the energy system, if we just look at what is happening at the production level and not looking at how the logistics system, the trade system is actually adding to the emissions, then we will be back again at COP talking about the same realities that we are still caught up within the climate crisis. But to take control of the situation, it will take us. And I think it's very critically important that African countries are in the driver's seat. Agriculture is contributing an energy massively to the emissions. The global food crisis and energy crisis is not making things easier, but it could be an opportunity because it gives us a bit of pressure, right, to depart from business as usual and look for local solutions that are going to give local communities the freedom they need for them to define their futures. But perhaps before we wrap it up, I'm going to ask maybe João and Fernanda if you've got last words in terms of the WWF perspectives and some of the next steps on the work that we are doing to support the strengthening of the African NDCs.
Fernanda, would you like to go first?
Well, just very quickly, we are saying this is an African COP, and this is also an implementation COP. So I would think that, to honor what is expected from this as an African COP and an implementation COP, I think a mitigation work program, as you mentioned, based on sectors lasting till 2030, that will have a package of actions that in which we can discuss, a package of actions that will also be met with incentives is a key result. Of course, delivering on adaptation and the funding facility for loss and damage, because we know there are people suffering now. That's the minimum package we need for the African COP. So I think that I will leave you with this. And all those things are equally important.
Yeah, for me, Nachilala, if I may, I think Africa is a very intriguing region because it has the power to learn from the mistakes that happen in the North and in the West. I am from Brazil. You know, if there are lessons to learn, don't learn the wrong lessons. You have the potential to do things much different as far as the food systems are concerned. I had the opportunity and the privilege to chair one of the action tracks of the UN Food Systems Summit. It was Action Track 3 on nature positive production. And within that action track, what we saw was African countries raising up their voices and their action to defend agroecological approaches and regenerative agriculture massively. It was amazing to see the voices that were raised in that action track. You know, so if there is an agroecology coalition that emerged from the UN Food Systems Summit, it was because of the 7 African countries that were front runners in it. So let's work together. I work for WWF. WWF is at your service, is at the service of your countries to do things that make sense for you, to help all of us cross-fertilize good lessons. So let's implement in Africa the models for going forward that do not commit the same mistakes as was done in many agricultural systems, especially in the North and in the West. Please. So let us help you the best we can. Along the road, we're going to make mistakes, you know, but we don't have time to think too much, right? I mean, if we're going to deliver the SDGs, we are 8 harvests away. Let's do the best we can with African soils and with African food systems. Nachilala, I was delighted to be in this panel. Thank you very much.
So I just want to close by thanking most sincerely all the speakers for bringing their perspective to this important subject on Africa's NDC implementation. I also want to thank you, the audience, for coming and also for your contribution. And I just want to end by saying, in our countries, we have national development plans, right? That's our business. But when it comes to the NDCs, it is our business, but it's also the business of our global partners. So it's crucial that we ensure that when we get back home, we have NDC plans that are comprehensive, that are clear, and that are time-bound. We know that NDC action plans are not the silver bullet, but the next best thing that we have. So thank you all very much. You're invited to a reception after this, and we can continue having the conversation. Thank you very much.